Waves by C. Don McCallum. Chapter 6. Mia wished her mother would put the lamplight out already, but she knew she was slow to get to that final chore tonight. It took Mencha longer to get ready for sleep. As sharp as her mind was, the old woman's body was slow. Mia sat by the door of the tent, ready to close her eyes to the darkness outside. Her body had been almost free of pain all day. She tried to fill herself with love for her mother, for the sound of Perla's voice, and the words she had spoken to her last night. Now that it was dark again, though, she couldn't find the strength to be all right with the silence of the fading fire outside. She hadn't seen Gerlain all day and was glad. She hoped he hadn't been able to sleep today. Maybe he would fall asleep on duty again tonight. Maybe the dream would come back and call her back to the field where she would finally be swallowed. But that would make her mother the last, and she didn't want to think of the pain that would cause her. Mia watched as Seema combed out the old woman's white hair. "Ulsa will be fine in the care tent with the patients," Mencha said. "She may not speak, but her hands are very capable." Their talking trailed out of Mia's mind, and she closed her eyes. She drifted in and out of their conversation like a leaf falling from the tree, switching back and forth through the air as it falls. "Thank you for coming, Mencha," Seema said. Mencha sighed and stood. "This is for the best." Sitting up by the tent flap, she walked to Mia and Perla's pallet. Mia closed her eyes again, trying to look as tired as she could, so that maybe her mother would finally turn out the lamp and they could all go to sleep. "It's been 2 nights since anyone was swallowed," the old woman went on. "It's good to have an extra pair of eyes on this one whose name is so often called." Mia knew that the edge in Mensch's voice meant that she didn't believe her. She didn't need to open her eyes to know that her new bed companion was looking at her. Mencha eased her way down to the pallet and said, "Perhaps we found a good use for Gerlain after all." Mia's eyes popped open. Mencha was about to lie down on her side of the pallet, where the storybook was hidden. "That's where I sleep," Mia yelled. The two women jerked their heads and looked at the girl who hadn't said more than 2 words all night. "Mia," Mencha said, "it's nice to see you haven't forgotten how to speak." Mia stood, her heart throbbing, and watched as Mencha placed her old hands behind her to push herself to the other side of the blankets, where Perla used to sleep. Inches away from her fingers was the storybook, hiding under the blanket. "Is this better?" she asked, annoyed. Mia nodded and sat down on her side of the pallet. "Well, good night, everyone," Seema said, heading for the lamp. "Good night," Mencha said in the darkness that followed. Mia put her hand on the book and lay down. "Good night," she mumbled as her eyes adjusted to the lack of light. Slowly the profile of the old woman emerged out of the blackness. Mencha's eyes were closed and her breathing was noisy. Mia shifted on the blankets, turning away from the woman sleeping in Perla's place. She had to get out of here. She didn't know where she was going to go, but she knew she would take the storybook with her. The darkness wrapped around Mia, and the stars took their time making themselves seen in her eyes. She walked slowly through the black night, afraid of making too much noise or running into anything as she went. She didn't know where she was going. Her eyes adjusted, and the starlight gave enough light to guide her as she took a tentative step forward onto the path. She crept like a wild animal seeking a scrap of food someone may have dropped by the fire, but that was not where she was going. She had to get away, but to where? She couldn't stand looking at the rubble of the old village anymore, even if she would barely be able to see it in the dark. There were too many memories out there, and some of them were still waiting to be uncovered under the stone and dust. Her head was too chaotic already to listen to the roar of the river, and the rushing water might be too tempting a way to stay out of the mouth of the world. The river would deny the world from swallowing her in the night, or whenever her time came to be covered in the soil of the burial mound. "I guess the world swallows everyone in the end," Mia thought, turning away from the river in the west. Gerlain was in the wilderness to the north, and he was the last person she wanted to see tonight. His blue eyes lost their effect in all this darkness. She didn't care anymore. Besides, he would only lie to her, and if the world called her name, he'd stand by watching as the lips encircled her ready body. No, she wouldn't go see him. Mia could hear the care tent rippling up by the silhouette she saw of the old school. Ulsa's up there, she thought. She probably told Mencha about what happened, and now the old woman was snoring in her bed where Perla used to sleep. The care tent was almost empty, but there would still be moaning. There would still be the memories of what the people in the cots used to be. I can go to the orchard and sleep under a tree, she thought, and headed toward the sound of the rustling leaves. The sweet smell of the blossoms pulled her to where the fruit would spring forth later on in the season, and her head felt light. Her feet left the gravel path and sunk into the squishy softness of the orchard grass. Mia leaned against a tree and breathed in. Her back to the tent village and the old square lying in ruin, the whole world seemed to disappear. Her heart floated a little and tension released from her body. She imagined she was Perla. Mia put her hands on the imaginary ladder in front of her and looked up at her father picking fruit from the tree. She tried to hear her father's voice, but all she heard was the wind. She listened for Perla's voice rising out of her own body, but all that came out was a sigh. The wind, the trees, the river would live on for who knows how long without ever hearing those voices again. To keep from crying, Mia looked out beyond the orchard, beyond the sweet blossoms and emerging fruits. The wilderness lurked out there, and in those trees rested the bodies of the villagers who'd been lost since the tree was planted so many seasons ago. The world seemed quieter out there. It seemed to have less to say. Out there was the place where words were stolen and hands were still. Suddenly blossoms passed over her head. She had vague feeling that her feet were moving. Her eyes set firmly on the silence beyond the fruit trees, and her heart felt peace. Mia walked into the wilderness and didn't look back at what she was leaving behind. The word wolf entered her head, but she wasn't afraid. She let the silence absorb her, and the starlight coming through the trees show her where to put her feet on the crackling pillow soil. The burial mound lay like a dead beast melted on the ground. The world under her feet was so soft she thought she would sink into it. She walked to the most recent mound and sat at the edge of the upturned dirt, listening to the wind. Leaves whispered all around her, saying nothing she could understand, but she thought she would try anyway. They seemed to tell her of all the yesterdays folded up in the air and soil. They told her of children running and parents watching them go. All the villagers grew older, stretching up to the sun like the tree overlooking the fountain, and new ones came to take their place while the old fell into the dirt like leaves and decayed in the sweet-smelling mulch. The stars drew Mia's gaze through the waving limbs, and she wondered where all the voices went. She wondered where their heartbeats went. Her heart felt so real in her chest. Sometimes she thought she could almost feel the blood coursing through her body. There has to be something more, she told herself. Without thinking, Mia pulled the old storybook from under her belt and opened a page. This time she wouldn't pretend like she was Perla about to read from the storybook. She wouldn't pretend that she was her father painted the images so more people in the village would see them and remember the cherished stories. She wouldn't breathe the book in like Jerlane, though the smell of it pushed out into the air. But she would touch the words, and drawing from her memory, she would let the words touch her. Mia looked at the picture of the woman standing, triumphant, in front of the mountain as she walked into the sea. She couldn't see the woman's eyes because of the darkness, but she knew the color of them, for they were like Jerlane's. She must have stared at the woman 100 times since she'd stolen the book. She remembered her teacher reading to them from the storybook and showing the picture to the children. Whenever the teacher turned the book back to himself to read, she could still see the woman's eyes staring into her own. But Mia wasn't like her sister. She couldn't remember the story word for word, but she caressed the tiny indentations of the words in front of her and tried to remember the story as much for herself as for the people lying in the stillness of the world's slow churning belly. For how much behind them could she be anyway? She felt the story rise from within her, aching to be told, to be heard. Her name was Simine, Mia told the darkness, resting the book on her lap. Simine lived in the valley all of her life, completely surrounded by the mountains that shot up around her like a great fence. From the time before she knew how to speak, she'd look at the mountains and wonder what they were hiding from her. Her mother's hands often grabbed Simin's face to put her eyes on what she was trying to teach her, taking her eyes from the place where the ground reached for the sky. Look here, Simin's mother would say. Watch what I'm doing. Learn. And Simin would focus on her mother's hands beating the clothes on the rock in the mountain stream. Simin watched the water pull the dirt away as it headed to the place where the sun rose every morning. She looked to the mountain where the water seemed to flow. When Simin learned how to talk, her parents seemed to wish they'd never taught her the words they used so carelessly. They didn't like how she spoke or that she asked so many questions. Where does the river go? She asked. What is on the other side of the mountain where the sun greets us every new day? No one knows the answers to those questions. Her parents would tell her before asking her to be quiet. There is no use in thinking about things you can never understand. But this answer didn't satisfy Simin. She had to find out where the river was going. She had to see what was on the other side of the mountain. She begged to be taken to see everything, to find all the answers to her questions. But all her parents wanted her to do was marry, so that she and her husband could have children whom Simin could teach to do things like beat clothes, clean in the river, and be quiet. You will marry Golmek, they told her. You will grow the village and not worry about this foolishness. The night before Simin was supposed to marry old Golmek, she stared up at the moon that was high and bright over the little village in the valley. Dearest moon, she said with tears in her eyes, where does the river go? What lies on the other side of the mountain that makes the river run so quickly, even as it cleans our clothes and gives us sweet water to drink and fish to eat? She opened her window and listened for the moon's answer, but all she could hear was the rushing river outside. Reaching for her shoes and a cloak to keep her warm, Simin climbed over the windowsill and into the night. Listening to the river, she used the light of the moon to show her the safest way to the river. She walked along the shore until the sun started to throw its light into the world. Thirsty, she took a sip of the river and looked behind her. Her village seemed so small in the little valley. She stood and pushed ahead, following the rushing stream. The mountain grew and grew, then shrunk again behind her as she saw a side of the mountain that she'd never seen before. She breathed in never before seen flowers. She looked into the eyes of animals new to her. Simin passed through valley after valley, following the river, drinking and eating from it as she went. This river was greater than she'd ever imagined. Then she crossed the final mountain pass. A stinging, sweet smell like she'd never known before filled the air. A low roar could be heard in the distance as the river grew. Simin descended the final mountain, and before her was something she'd never heard of or seen in all of her life. Before her was the greatest river she'd ever seen. Waves crashed on the gritty dirt under her feet. The music of the water held her captive. She could not go back to her tiny village now, but how could she leave them unaware of the great secret? Simin walked into the waves and planned how she would live here for the rest of her life. She looked for a place the villagers could build. Mia was quiet. She could still feel the words vibrating in her throat and chest. She could still hear them in the air. Before she started the story, the words didn't want to come. She had opened her mouth, and like the river in the story, it flowed and flowed. But would she be able to find her way through the darkness like Simin? She looked up. Barely any light peeked through the trees now, but it seemed strangely bright where she sat. Mia closed the book, shutting the world off from its sweet scent she was growing to love. Setting the book on the ground, she lay down on the soft earth. She would use the book as a pillow tonight. Mia closed her eyes and listened for some meaning to seep up through the soil like a new spring. But she heard a different noise, the noise of slow walking in the crackling wilderness. Rolling onto her back, and she looked over her shoulder. She didn't see the wolf's eyes, but she could see his head and powerful body was turned to her. Mia leaned back on her side and closed her eyes. In a world where people were being swallowed in the night and the ground shook its violence into the sky, wolves didn't scare her. Not anymore. Not ever again. And the wolf crept away. Thank you for listening to Chapter 5 of Waves by C. Don McCallum. If you're enjoying this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know. And please like the video and subscribe to this channel to help others discover these stories.